Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event. We're very happy to see that so many of you have joined us here, even physically, even though the topic that we will discuss is perhaps not very joyous. So this event is arranged by Bergen Global, which is a CMI-UIB collaboration that I will talk a bit more at the end of the meeting. And my name is Thor Olav Iversen. So besides doing some moderation for Bergen Global, I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and Humanities, or the SVT, here at the University of Bergen. And I will soon also introduce our distinguished guests, one of which is running a bit late, Don Kalb. But before that, I would like to start with a quote that has been repeated many times the last week, so it's perhaps not very original. And that is a quote by what could be said to be a historical actor, I guess, in this conflict or situation, which is Vladimir Lenin. And that is that there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And to me, it seems safe to say that we have been through such weeks, because 1 month ago today, Russia launched a pretty much full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has thrust the world into what seems to be a new and unpredictable era of global politics. So in this meeting, we would like to zoom a bit out of the everyday happenings and details of the conflict and take a bird's eye view of how is this conflict shaping our world at large. And on my part, I know the conflict a bit as I've been a humanitarian aid worker for the World Food Programme in Ukraine and Donbass, but I am by no means an academic expert on this field. And we are therefore fortunate to have with us Dr. Elina Troscenko, and she's a social anthropologist here at the University of Bergen, currently working on the global research program on inequality, and her researchers focus on in particular on the post-Soviet, the different regions of the post-Soviet space. And then soon to join us, Professor Don Kalb, who's a professor of social anthropology also at the University of Bergen. And has done a lot of research on post-socialist transformation. So I would like to ask you, Elina, just to start with, how do you know Ukraine and Russia and this sort of post-Soviet space?
Thank you for inviting me and for the introduction.
Our pleasure.
So my insights and knowledge about the region at large come from a long-term engagement and work in the region. I am myself from the Baltics, from Latvia, so kind of first-hand insights on that part. And my academic line of work there has been related to nation-building processes in Latvia in the 90s, especially concerning and relating to Russian-speaking minorities in Latvia. I have also been working in Georgia on internally displaced people from Abkhazia, and as you know, also Georgia has a difficult history and has two breakaway regions where Russian involvement has been.
Abkhazia is one of the breakaway regions,
yeah,
right,
exactly.
of Georgia that was sort of invaded by Russia in 2010.
So so Russia's involvement also in this breakaway region has been. Russia has been very present there, and I've been also working in Kyrgyzstan, so Central Asia. Where I was looking at exploring border and citizenship regime changes following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and I was specifically working with stateless populations living and Uzbek minorities living along the Kyrgyz-Uzbek border. And so, of course, all these regions have a connections to Russia, and Russia is ever present, and they all have different relationships with Russia that also is reflected in the way they have responded to the ongoing war.
Yeah. That's great. So you have really worked with in all the different post-Soviet republics. So that's great. Hi, Don.
I'm sure.
No, you got there just in time. Like it was, we're just about to ask you how you know the Russia and Ukraine. So that's perfect.
Very good. It's a big city, Bergen, you know.
Let's see. Is it on?
Is that no? You put on.
Okay, there we are. Okay, hi Don. Good morning. So how do you know like Ukraine and Russia and the post-Soviet space?
You want me to tell me? But you want to tell me? You want me to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing there?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
yeah, I've been working on it for about 30 years. I was not born there, but I got engaged with Central Eastern Europe in the 1990s, when that was still the wild part of the world. I was director of a Ford Foundation institution in Vienna, where we started to feed into social policy research in Central and Eastern Europe, because in those days, in the mid-90s, the US thought we're going to lose Poland, right? The way they're now losing, in a way, Russia. We're going to lose Poland. And so they created an institution that was going to feed into research networks so that they could counter the hard neoliberalism of the post-communists, right? And so that was my start. And then I worked for about 15 years at Central European University in Budapest, doing research in Poland, Hungary, but I was a lot engaged in Ukraine, Russia, Central Asia, Caucasus. So that's the summary.
Thanks a lot, Tom. So, like, just to start, I would just like to ask you just sort of a bit of an open question on the backdrop of everything that's happened until like the invasion. Like, were you surprised by the invasion itself?
Well, the fact is that I was asked by Berg and Stiedende whether there would be an invasion or not. And I declared, as sure as I usually am of my insight, I said no. But that was not because I did not understand the logics that are driving it all towards war, but it was because I was still in the expectation that Putin was a rational actor. And so even though we all understood that things were getting ever more tight and dangerous, I thought he would just recognize the Luhansk and Donetsk, perhaps move in with the army very openly, but no, the war like this, a full invasion, I hadn't expected that.
How about you, Elina?
No, the same. And Don and I actually had a small chat about it a week before the invasion, and we discussed what. So what do we think? And we were both agreed that not a full-scale invasion, maybe Donetsk and Luhansk, but not a full-scale war.
Exactly.
So that came as a surprise both to us and I think to the large part of the researchers who are experts on the region. So it came as a shock for many of us. So it seems that the military intel was the only ones who kind of kind of insights from
So I was talking to former students of mine from Ukraine and from Russia, and they actually all expected the war to happen. So,
well, I was talking also with some Ukrainian and Latvian, and they did not expect. Opinions are dividing me there, but I think you are correct that we all kind of, or many of us, were trying to rationalize, right? What would be the pros and cons, and what are the gains and possible losses if Putin would go for it. And I think also another thing is that it was just so unimaginable, a war on that scale. So I think from just a human perspective, to imagine something like that, there were also some constraints to that.
There has of course been a lot of sort of psychologizing about Putin in the newspapers, and there's of course a psychologizing literature about Putin in the last 20 years. Normally I don't buy that, but and I would also not say that we see, let's say, a long-run logic that must have led to this invasion. So I have a little bit the feeling that indeed his isolation over the last 2 years in the pandemic, I mean, these grotesque meetings that we saw on television, something has snapped there. And so, but as I said, so Vladimir Artyuk, for example, one of the active authors at the moment in social media, who worked, he was a student of mine, and he worked on Belarus, and he is from Ukraine. He actually escaped Ukraine from the fascist forces in the last years, because there's a lot of left-wing intellectuals that actually left Ukraine after 2014. because the fascists were very threatening. People who were, being beaten up on the street and so on.
Local nationalists.
Yeah, I call them fascists. They call themselves fascists, right? Because it's, social fascism is an accepted term in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So all these people were actually, well, Volodymyr Artyuk said that this is rational rage on the part of Putin, and it's perhaps a good way to see it. A violent gamble showing the West how angry he really is. The question is, of course, did he anticipate what he was getting back? He didn't. He clearly didn't. The unification of the West is a surprise, I think, for all of us, and we should talk a little bit more about this, of course, when it comes to geopolitics. But he also cannot control the logic of the military developments itself.
Yes.
So it was a rational rage, perhaps as a gamble to begin with, but I don't think that it is rational overall.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Now I think we should, as I promised in the start of the introduction, zoom a bit out and look at the bit long lines here. So could you try to draw some long lines on the sort of with regards to the history from the breakdown of the Soviet Union or leading up to this conflict? What do you think are the most relevant factors and historical developments? Which is a difficult question, I'm sure, but yeah.
You want to start, John?
Yeah, I've written about it, so I have my answer ready, but perhaps you want to go first.
Yeah. It also depends what you mean by region. It's huge, right? So there have been many developments.
I'm sure.
So some of maybe points I would like to mention is, of course, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and various perceptions of the fact as such are also diverse in the region, ranging from Baltics to Central Asia, how the dissolution of the Soviet Union was perceived and celebrated or not. Then you, of course, have nation building processes in all these countries involving different elements, also different ways of how to dealing or incorporating past. You have diverging political trajectories of the various regions. You have Baltics with a steady course in the EU and NATO. You have Central Asia, more institutionalizing and creating closer ties with Russia. Of course, you have Ukraine and Georgia in between. Then you also have color revolutions.
Yes.
Happening in the region. You have, of course, something that I maybe should have mentioned also was the wild East, so to say, the expansion of capitalism and neoliberal markets, largely uncontrolled and regulated.
Neoliberalism meaning market reforms.
Structural adjustments and so on. And to a large extent, how that also eroded the welfare state and welfare system in these countries. The ugly face of capitalism that showed and revealed itself in many of these places, and the hopes that many people had relating to this new era and disillusionment that followed, but also, to my opinion, fueled many of the color revolutions and unrests that we had seen in these areas that were often maybe analyzed as and framed as uprising against corrupt governments, but I think those to a large extent were also influenced by the neoliberal economies that were unfolding, and many people, lost their livelihoods, and the security networks that used to be in place were eroded, and the monetization of social fabric as such that took place. And of course, Russia that emerged, particularly from the end of the 90s and during the 2000s, as a consolidating power in the region, both establishing itself as a political and economic player, institutionalizing its role through such agreements as Eurasian Economic Union, and attaching the near or broad to itself in myriad of ways, just like through migration patterns and so on.
And the Eurasian Economic Union, that's sort of like a counter move to the, you could say to some extent, to the EU, where there's an economic and political integration in the post-Soviet space. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So Don.
I find it important to emphasize that it is a global war. It's not a regional war. It's a global war for various reasons. First, very simply, geopolitical, geostrategic. It is probably unimaginable that Putin would have made this gamble if China had not been there too, right? So the rise of China as a geopolitical and an economic powerful unit within post-1989 globalization, that's of course the sort of master process that we're talking about, was essential for Putin to do this. So what you get is, you remember Immanuel Kant, right? About 200 years ago, he wrote this beautiful piece about perpetual peace. And perpetual peace was a sort of, singing the hymn of what we now would probably call liberal peace. And liberal peace is the assumption that if you trade, so if you spread the market, people become dependent on each other and there won't be war. Now, the liberal peace thesis has been around, has been a sort of inherent part of the globalization drive and the globalization myth since 1989. So this would sort of unify the world. You can talk about cultural terms too. It would unify the world in terms of, a sort of shared perspective on things. But what a good Marxist would say is, look, markets all fine, but it's all about oligopolistic position taking. It's not an open market. It's a network, and the different nodes in this network allow different geopolitical resources to accumulate. So at some point in any sort of globalization cycle in history, there are big forces talking back to the hegemon. Now, that has, of course, happened in a very general sense. Then there's this other key issue within neoliberal globalization. All globalizations are neoliberal in history, or in any case, sort of liberal. And you can easily imagine why that is so, because they are pro-market, right? All these globalizations produce massive inequalities. That has been true, as we know, worldwide. Any domestic politics is dealing with increasing social polarizations, even though, on a world level, there has been a sort of equalization, but nevertheless, all these political units have become ever more unequal. And now here's the issue. Russia and Ukraine are among the most unequal of all these units, right? And in very, very similar ways, they're very similar units. Domestically. And why are they similar? Well, they produce this huge social inequality where a very small layer, of oligarchs extracts wealth out of the country, exports it abroad into the system, and gets its valorization of its wealth there, but not locally. Of course, the difference between Ukraine and Russia is that in Russia, you had a Kremlin after 1992 that had an imperial history and it had the resources after Yeltsin, with Putin coming in. And we can go into detail because that was, of course, also an important moment for Putin to show that he was already sort of neo-nationalist. The way he leveled out Grozny in 1999 is a prefiguration of what's happening now, right? But nevertheless, Putin disciplined the oligarchs and then disciplined the regions of Russia, huge country. The governors were sort of autonomous little states by 1995. So he disciplined the oligarchs, he disciplined the regions, and he unified the Kremlin again in a way that we know about Kremlin, right? So, but that was predicated on the imperial resources, the administrative resources, juridical resources of the Kremlin itself. Of course, Ukraine, never having been in a real state, in 1000 after Christ it was, but that doesn't matter. But it became a real state only in the course of Brest-Litovsk, 1918. The famous and calamitous peace agreement between Germany and Russia. never had this imperial center and these imperial bureaucratic legal resources. And so Ukraine is Russia without a Putin and a Kremlin, right? And that is why it was always sort of falling apart. But here's the issue, and that is why it's also a global war. All these states, all of Norway not, but all the rest, let us say it like that, are dealing with this terrible social polarization issue, which makes all of these governing classes somewhat illegitimate, right, in the eyes of growing populations. Now, there's two ways to deal with that. You can have a left-wing critique on liberal centrism, or you can have a right-wing critique on that, right? And then it becomes neo-nationalist, it can become fascist, etc., or religious fascist, religious nationalist, anyhow. Now, what you see in Ukraine and in Russia is a logic of neo-nationalism over time, where in very different ways, rulers are being set up that are not really hegemonic, but that nevertheless become dominant by tapping into neo-nationalist critiques on neoliberalism and producing the sense of a community of faith in countries that are entirely polarized, right? And so, and of course, it's not a singular logic in these two countries. We see the same in Southern and Eastern Europe. Everywhere in post-socialism, these states were very, very vulnerable for these developments. But of course, this happens in excessive ways in Ukraine and in Russia, and then in mutually antagonizing ways.
So the main purveyors of critique of the sort of neoliberal establishment or the political establishment in these post-Soviet spaces have been nationalists. That is, yeah.
Yeah, so let us say post-Tsarist in the case of Putin. When I say neo-nationalist, I just don't only mean ethno-nationalist. They are ethno-nationalists, so there emerged the Ukrainian nationalism, and there emerged a much stronger Russian, and of course a reivindicative and revanchist Russian nationalism. But that also pertains, for example, to, in the case of Putin, to patriarchy. Very, very strict gender ideologies. His affiliation with Alexander Dugin, for example, who is a famous global fascist Russian, who explicitly goes back to the Nazi leader Heydrich in his vision. That is basically the state ideology of Putin at the moment, plus the Orthodox Church, except that Putin keeps a sort of pragmatic relationship to them. But that's the sort of thing that has been set up in Russia. We can talk about Ukraine, it's of course very different, but nevertheless you have also this neo-nationalist thing that certainly after the Maidan created not a population that was neo-nationalist, and I would never say anything like that, but nevertheless a state that was inclined towards, well, that had elements within it, in particular in its security apparatus, in its legal apparatus, that was pushing for ever more Ukrainianization against the Russian language, for example.
Which is prevalent in Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah.
But having said that, of course, the way NATO has been dealing with the rise of political centers within globalization that over time were willing and able to talk back to it has been pretty irresponsible, right? That is also something that we must say. And again, when I say that, I don't justify Putin, right? This is an explanation of geopolitical relationships. John Mersheimer has been arguing this, of course, famously. I think he's entirely right about it. And he's, of course, not alone. George Kennan, basically the inspirer of containment policies on the part of the US, the ideologies of containment. He also said already in 1996 that it was an enormous failure, that Russia was not allowed a slightly different place than a purely antagonistic one in relation to NATO.
Thanks a lot, Don. I think we now have to return to the here and now.
Yes,
thanks a lot. I would also just like to say that if you're following us online, you can write your questions or comments in the chat, and we will try to get to them at the end of the meeting, when we will also take questions from the audience. So please write down any questions you have. And so now I would like to touch a bit more upon sort of the geopolitical consequences of the war. So are we seeing like a realignment or the formation of new geopolitical blocks in the world? So perhaps I can start with asking you, Elina, like how is this affecting the post-Soviet space at large with regards to its own coherence as a political bloc?
You have it behind.
Sorry.
Oh, it's here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the consequences of the war and the impact is yet to be seen because we're still in it, and the question is also how it will evolve and develop and end. So I think it might be too early to say, because we also see some regions in, for example, Central Asia, trying to balance its relationship with Russia, and it also depends, where will Russia go from here? What's the next step? But I think that there are things that we have been clearly seeing already before, and that's become much more visible now in very violent ways, is how the post-Soviet space already has been changing. The borders have been moving there for a longer period of time. I mean, if you look at the crawling occupation in Georgia in relation to breakaway regions, if you see this institutional move of borders in Crimea, you can also see how, in very visible ways, Russia has taken control over Belarus after the Belarusian protests. I mean, there's a sign in Lithuania, a road sign in Lithuania pointing to Minsk, under which it says occupied by Russia. So you have very clearly kind of ideas of, the power constellations, how they're changing. And now you can see very visibly how, in violent ways, there are again attempts to change the borders of some regions of this post-Soviet space. Yeah, so things are on move. And I think also the world as we know it is in unmaking, and it's yet to be seen what will come out on the other side. So in a post-Soviet space, there are definitely changes. And I think also we're seeing, for example, in the Baltics, that will, to my opinion, to a large degree, will turn into these militarized territories. As also in Europe, we will see a new levels of secularization and militarization.
Because NATO has been moving quite a lot of forces to Eastern Europe and also the Baltics.
Yes.
Yes. So Don, like you, like following up on that, like you touched upon what has the consequence this has for the West as a political bloc. So are we seeing sort of the rise as a response to this of a more unified and muscular West?
Yeah. Again, we're really good, the two of us together, because you have a closer regionalist perspective, and I broaden it up again, because of course the consequences are again very global. The West itself was falling apart, right, over the last 10 years, and it was also closely related to these increasing social inequalities and all these national units. Trump is only the sort of simple word for that, Brexit, and so on and so on. This war is a fantastic tool for the West, for liberal forces in the West, to recapture the liberal thought as an identity space, to marginalize the populists, to reintegrate the left into a sort of reformism. And so it's a wonderful moment for the West, except that it is a moment. I mean, Larry Fink this morning, Larry Fink of BlackRock, I always believe in Larry Fink. Larry said, this is the end of globalization. I think he's right. And it's not abrupt, but it is certainly a massive accelerator of the reversal. So what we are seeing is the emergence of well, basically two blocs, it might be three, that will be openly rivaling. This war is not only a war about Central and Eastern Europe and Ukraine, it's also a war where the West shows China what might happen to it if it goes to war with the West over Taiwan. I think that, and you actually can see that in the So the French and the German position is much more cautious in relation to Ukraine. And that's not for nothing so. It's not because they don't believe in democracy or something like that, or in freedom. But for the US, this is a war that they can drive to the max, where they can show their financial and economic power, but also, of course, also military power. And they show to China what might happen to China, basically, cutting out of the financial networks and out of globalization if they go into Taiwan. So that is one very, very important issue, two important issues. So the unification of the West around the old freedom, liberal democratic idea, and a preparation for global wars that are around those values, but that are being waged both militarily and financially. Financial power of the West is still huge, right? So the interesting thing is that you have these political capitalisms emerging, China, Russia, that talk back to the West, but the values, the capitalist values that are circling around in those political units are in the end entirely invested in and dependent on the capitalist value making process, let us say in Wall Street, right? That is the simple sort of summary of this all. So what you see in the case of Russia is that the US simply shows that, look, we are the capitalist hegemon. If we cut you out, nothing of what you do has much value anymore, right? And so they lost their whole wealth fund, et cetera, et cetera. The expectation is that GDP of Russia will be about 30% less in 2 years from now. If the war and the warring continues, which I think is likely, this might be reduced to 50%. So, the social inequality in Russia will only dramatically further increase. But there's one very important other aspect, and that's mostly out of the picture. So we are going to have massive inflation, right? And then so food and oil and gas feed into all the products, right? So we're going to have massive inflation. We're going to have an oil price already this year. By the end of the year, the oil traders expect $250 the barrel, right? That's 2 times more than now. And now it's 2 times more than last year. We've heard about grain and maize, corn. There will be what has historically been called IMF riots in the global south, right? That is, we should absolutely expect that. Here again, we have terribly unequal domestic political units, where political elites have very, very fragile legitimacy. We are going to see a repetition of 2010, 2011, right? So massive revolts in the global south. I'm referring to the Arab Spring. It might be again in the Arab, in the North African and the Middle Eastern worlds, because they depend so much on the Ukrainian grain. It might be Indonesia, it might be Central Africa. So what we are going to see is a massive reconfiguration of the global scene that doesn't compare at all to the sort of globalization high life of 5 years ago before the pandemic, and where social inequalities and violence will explode on a local level in relationship to national elites and on a global level in terms of the positioning towards what comes after globalization.
Yeah, so hunger breeds conflict and conflict breeds hunger. So there you have it. And,
and also, like you touched upon, energy policies and energy markets are being levied as a very important part of this conflict. Like, is Ukraine still importing Russian gas?
I have not been following that.
No, but in any case, like, how does Russia levy its position as a major fossil fuel exporter in this conflict?
Don, do you know?
Well, that is actually interesting, the events over the last days where Russia is threatening the West, that is going to cut off the West, in a sort of return action, to cut off the West from its oil, and that wants its oil to be paid in ruble and so on. Those are interesting sort of, talking back efforts of the Russians, but on a capitalist level, they basically cannot really talk back, is what I would say. I have not highlighted a crucial element in this whole equation. So it's massive inflation, and there will be revolts and violence. But there will also be inevitably very high interest rates. And we all know what the combination between high inflation and high interest rates means, right? So we're going back. The original moment of neoliberal globalization is really the Volcker moment of 1980, where the interest rates on the US dollar were tripled overnight to 15%, 18%. We're not getting that sort of interest rate, but if we have an oil price of $250 and an interest rate of 8%, which might be possible, let's say, not perhaps at the end of this year, but the end of next year, if you listen to the central bankers, then there will be massive unemployment in the West too, right? And so we're getting into a situation where it's absolutely not certain that our policymakers and governors are actually in control of the developments they're setting into motion and keeping into motion.
And Europe has been dependent on Russian energy supplies, right? So how will that play in, and how they're going to diversify the energy resources? So where will they take it from? Latvia is dependent on it, and I know it was recently in conversations with Norway about increasing supplies from Norway. There are also been, I think EU is also discussing larger investments in green energy shifts, but of course it's not something that can be done fast, and to what extent. We have also seen Germany's hesitations regarding sanctions, because Germany is also heavily dependent on Russian energy supplies. Yeah, I think everybody is now looking for solutions, how to deal with Russia and sanctions. But of course, it's a very big revenue pot for Russia, how it earns its money, right? So, the world needs oil right now. So I think there's still a lot of pragmatism around it.
From all sides.
Yes. So it's one, what kind of political statements are being made, but on the other hand, it's also the pragmatism of realpolitik.
Mm-hmm. And you touched upon Germany, which has been sort of been an example that has been used a lot about the consequences of this war. So do you have any comments with regards to the German response overall?
Yeah. Look, I think NATO is the worst possible solution for the problems it itself creates. So I speak from that position. In other words, I don't believe that militarization is a solution for anything of this. Nevertheless, at this particular moment, it would also be not so nice to do without NATO. So I'm actually pretty happy with the German decision to, well, it's not just the 100 billion, it's not just, more than 2%. Germany, 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago in the weekend, basically made the decision, we are going to defend the EU and Europe. That was an essential decision to make, I think. Without the Germans saying that, we are entirely on the lap of the Americans. And as I said, I think the Americans are playing a ruthless game that is not about Europe or about Ukraine, but it is about their global position. So what is going to happen within NATO if Germany is going to play this role is a much stronger possibility for Europe to talk back to the US and perhaps over time say, well, you deal with China and let us just run the show here, militarily speaking. Yeah.
So one more relationship that I wanted to touch upon before we open for a question is the relationship between Russia and China, and you touched a bit upon it already, Don. So that this relationship has been also important to these, in a sense, to this conflict. And do you think that this conflict will more closely integrate or drive China and Russia more together, or will it cause division?
Well, I think China is right now a winner of the situation because it is very well positioned And of course, we see Russia's attempt to hold a dialogue with China open. So I think, yeah, we might see closer relationship developing between Russia and China, but I think China is also, you know, this territorial integrity question has been important for China. But I think also we will see other regions, maybe, for example, Central Asia, developing closer ties with China. China has been very present in Central Asia.
As a response to this invasion.
Yes, and also because I think that economically Central Asia will be hit very hard. It's deeply dependent on Russia and has very close ties both economically and politically. There are millions of Central Asian migrants working in Russia. Many countries in Central Asia are heavily dependent on remittances. And the economies of these countries are already struggling in the aftermath of pandemic. So that we might see a even closer relation developing between China and Central Asia. And China has been very interested in the region as such before. And it is also interested in stability of the region as it's next to Xinjiang. So it's, yeah.
Mm. So Central Asia is bordering Xinjiang, where you have the Uyghur minority and that whole,
It's very difficult to make a good analysis there. I think at this moment, the US is in a short-term position to play Russia and China out of each other because of its financial and capitalist power. It will take another 2 months or something for China to realize that they cannot really side with Russia. That is my expectation. But it will not over time increase the hegemony of the US over the system, because there will be very bitter feelings both in Russia and in China about this. And so over time, they will try to find ways around it. The crucial question here in the end is perhaps not Russia, but really China. And of course, but the two can be potentially a very strong competing alliance. The question is really, can China globalize the renminbi, right? That is the renminbi, the Chinese currency. Yep. That is really the question, and it's interesting stuff, because this really hits at what capitalism as a global system is. So I would have the very simple position that a political capitalism cannot really globalize its currency, and that is because there will be too many domestic actors that will have control over that currency. To the detriment of capitalists abroad, right? And so for a while they can align, but over time, I think that cannot really happen. So I'm afraid that, the dollar and perhaps the euro as a second will remain the only global currencies. And, the renminbi has only 15% of global savings and so on, as you probably know. But there is one other really interesting thing here, and I've seen very few people pointing it out. So at the vote at the UN, all the BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, all the BRICS kept their solidarity up, and so none of them actually voted for the US and for the Western resolution to condemn Russia.
Meaning they were neutral or abstained.
Yeah, they were either neutral or they supported Russia. I think that is a very telling signal. It shows that the way in which the US has been losing its hegemony over time. And when I say hegemony, I don't mean raw power and raw capitalist power, but really the capacity to generate consent and alliances has been eroding terribly. And as you've seen, lots of Central African and even Latin America have not aligned with the West on this. So yeah, so the picture looks like deepening fragmentation on the short term. I think China will not keep up its full alliance with Russia, but on the longer term there will be an effort on their parts to align against the West again. There's no doubt about it. We should also perhaps talk about how long do we expect the war to continue and how.
Mm-hmm. Yep, please go ahead. And after we will open for questions from the audience.
Of course, there was the expectation on the part of Putin that it would be very fast. There's now an expectation by all sorts of commentators that it might be, 10 weeks, 2 or 3 months. But that all of that depends on the capacity to actually end the war, both on the part of Russia, on the part of Ukraine, and on the part of the West, but of course with the US as the major vote in there. I think that the war is too profitable in terms of their legitimacy for Putin, for Zelensky, and for Biden, right? It unifies the West. It creates a unified nation, Ukraine, that never existed. And it allows Putin to create a lot of turbulence around Russian borders and keep the nation in a war condition. So for all three, this is really just a pretty ideal situation in many ways. And so I am afraid that it might not be 10 weeks, but 10 months. The destruction will be huge. There will be a push towards a sort of peacemaking from that moment on, more successful than now. But I assume that after that we will have a low-profile war going on without a fixed peace. Also because the US, of course, in the end, wants to keep China alert to the fact that it can keep wars going, right? And certainly Putin would love to keep the war going too. But Zelensky is also a very interesting actor in this, right? He is certainly not a peacemaker, as you have probably noticed. Right? So the peace that is going to be the peace is the peace that basically was dictated by Russia before the war, right? So all these deaths and destruction are to a very large extent for nothing.
Sorry, the last point, that the peace is going to be the peace dictated by Russia.
Well, yeah, so any peace that will emerge out of this will be a peace that looks very closely to the dictates that Russia was trying to make before the war, right? And that Zelensky did not want to accept, and the West didn't want to accept, including Ukraine not being part of NATO, including losing the East, Luhansk and Donetsk. It will be very difficult for Zelensky to give up Crimea, but I mean, I think even the West is going to tell them that, look, I mean, the Russians are there. If they don't want to go, then they don't want to go. So it's just not regime change that is going to happen, right? Or the denazification, even though I'm absolutely certain that the leveling of Mariupol in the eyes of Putin is one particular form of denazification because the Azov brigade is there.
If I can comment that also on this narrative on denazification, because we have heard a lot about it in Putin's framing of the war. But I mean, and many have looked at it through what it means in Ukrainian context. But I also think a very important point is how this narrative is being sold to home audience that is in Russia. Because that's to a large part to whom Putin is talking and speaking to, right? To kind of gain support for the war. And here I think also it's important to talk about, you touched upon nationalism and neo-nationalism in Russia, but the Soviet Union's history, particularly the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as called in Russia, and the victory over Nazi Germany is a very central element in nation-building processes in Russia that has been used for decades. And the celebrations of the Victory Day, how lavish and grand they are in Russia. So it's a very important identity element in nation-building process in Russia. And it also has created an image of Russia as defender and liberator of Nazism. So when Putin is using this vocabulary, it is very recognizable for people in Russia. And, and it speaks to their historical legacy as being defenders and liberators. So for me, it is also a very important element to take into account when we look at what kind of vocabulary is being used around the war.
Yes, thank you. That's very enlightening. Now I think we will open up for questions from the audience. So I think please just take up your hand, and for the sake of the audience following online, I will also repeat the questions. So is there anyone that have questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. It's very comfortable to talk about Ukrainian war without Ukrainian invasion. about Russia, justified by a Lenin perspective, Marxist, what is Ukraine is actually fighting against. I'm Ukrainian, by the way, and today I represent Ukraine. And you have labeled my country as a country of social fascism. Now I am Ukraine, so please repeat it and justify the actions of Russia from your perspective. This is the first one.
The actions of Russia cannot be justified. This is a war crime.
If you dare to label what is happening in Ukraine as fascism, then I want to hear what is happening from the Russian side from your perspective. And all the audience.
I find Russia a fascist state. I don't find Ukraine a fascist state, and I have said I would never say that Ukraine is fascist. I've said that explicitly, but denying the fact that there has been a fascist development around the Maidan and has infested itself in particular parts of the state, that is not smart. And the US and the EU should have been dealing with this in 2015, 16, 17, and they have not done that.
Again, I repeat my question. You just said that Russia is fascist, and then you return back to Ukrainian fascism?
I have said it very clearly. Russia is at this point in time a fascist state.
Okay, I think we're not going anywhere with this discussion currently, so I think we'll move on. Is there any further questions? Sigurd?
Yes, here about the impact of the food situation in the country and outside. How is impact that? Ukraine is a very big exporter of food.
Yes. So your question was like, how is the food situation both domestically in Ukraine, and also how is it affecting food markets outside Ukraine?
So Ukraine produces about 10% of global grains. That falls away. The fear now is that there won't be any sowing going on, right? Which should be in the next 3 weeks. That will produce, well, both hunger in Ukraine itself, but Ukraine is, of course, already in a terrible position. But it will also produce hunger abroad. And this is not primarily an issue for the West, because with our purchasing power, we can always take care that the foods flow in our direction. It's just inflation for us. But it means that the foods are not going to other places where you don't have that purchasing power. And so that is always the trouble in the situation of scarcity of grains, that, you know, the powerful capitalist countries don't really suffer from that, but it's an effect that reverberates to the system and in the global South in particular.
Yeah, so the food system as we have, it's deeply unequal, right? So food distribution around the world, the inequality of that. And of course, here the prices will rise, but it won't be an issue here. However, many countries are importing 80, 90% of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. So they will be deeply affected. And also, even returning back to Central Asia that I know.
Yes, please.
For example, Russia has also suspended exports of wheat to countries within the Eurasian Economic Union. And so it also creates concern about food security there. And yeah, it will definitely see the impact and of the food insecurity yeah, unrests and conflicts relating to that.
Also in the previous Soviet republics.
As well, it might,
Yes.
it depends how the situation will evolve, but right now there is a great concern. And of course, as Don mentioned, it's not only now, but also the long-term effects when Ukraine, for example, will be able to return back to the production of agricultural production. So it's also a question about the long-term situation of this.
And we have one question also from online, which is, how has Western Europe viewed Eastern Europe before this? Has that changed now? Maybe you, Elina.
Sorry,
how has Western Europe viewed Eastern Europe before this conflict? And has that changed now? Do do you have any reflections?
There have been many voices raised by the Eastern European scholars about the marginalization of Eastern Europe and the voices from there in also European intellectual thought. And I was listening just to a seminar the other day when a Ukrainian scholar sitting in Lviv that had been bombed, their bombs been flying outside Lviv the same day. And he was referring to a seminar that he was invited to be a part of in Norway, and just as the conflict and the war started. And the first thing that Norwegian colleagues asked him was, tell us about Ukraine, we know nothing about it. And for him, it was shocking. How is it possible that in a European context, that kind of question is being asked about one of the largest countries in Europe, you know, the largest in size its area, with over 40 million people. So that's shocking. It also shows how the hierarchies of knowledge and which places matter more and matter less in the Western context. So Eastern Europe has been marginalized, and its importance has been marginalized. So I think it's also something that is need to be reflected upon, and yeah, for us as scholars as well.
Yes, and are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, I read in the news that the US were kind of considering buying oil from Venezuela because they wanted to decrease their dependency on Russia. And I just think that's a very interesting development.
Very interesting question. The US is considering buying oil from Venezuela, and I think they also had meetings. Like Maduro actually met US officials, which is interesting enough if you know the recent history of the region. So do anyone of you have any comments for that?
Yeah, it's already been sabotaged, so it's not going to happen. Yeah, because of course there are strong lobbies within the US state that don't want that to happen, and so it was withdrawn.
We actually have one more question, so let's have that, and then we can perhaps reflect on both. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're speaking about reverberations and future scenarios that this war can have globally, and also for the European Union. And I was wondering if you think that what's happening now with the refugees of Ukraine within the European Union and how they have been received will be able to be a kind of precedent for future policies towards refugees from any other conflicts.
So will the reception of the Ukrainian refugees in Europe have any precedent for the reception of future refugees from other places, I guess? Correct. Yes.
Oh, it's a speculative question on a terrain that I'm not so certain about. It is, of course, very pleasant to see that Europe, and in particular those states that were very much anti-immigrant in the East, is opening up in the way it is doing. I'm very happy to see that. What is also very interesting is that the East European states that are not part of the Euro system are actually able to do a little bit of quantitative easing to help, in a literal sense, to help Ukrainian refugees to get some money. So they get, for example, in Poland, I think they get 300 euros, just, you know, to have a little bit of pocket money. Of course, not much at all, but they can do that, and they simply do it because the central bank is simply producing the money. In the West of Europe, in the Euro system, no state can really do that. And so what I really hope is that there's also a reflection about sovereignty over the euro, right? And not just set up the euro as a gold standard for all these countries and then let them compete around it, but allow a European sovereignty over the euro so that we can, you know, actually deal with these emergencies in a way that does not immediately affect the fiscal position of states, right? And so, well, I'm very happy to see Poland has accepted 3 million refugees, I think, or am I wrong about that? Well, that would almost be 8% of its own population. So, and then the same is true for Romania, for Hungary, right? Which was all about You know, this is for the Hungarians and we are in a war with the wider world and nobody's coming in here.
And next week we will have an event about the Hungarian elections. Okay.
Okay,
And,
very good.
I think with
Very
that, I think I actually have to. Yeah, time is up. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for posting your questions and perspective and things like that. And particularly thanks to Professor Don Kalb and Dr. Elina Troscenko. We were super happy that you could join us for this event. And I would also like to say, again, Bergen Global, it's a CMI-UIB collaboration. You can follow Bergen Global for further events in social media and also sign up to our newsletter to get more updates. And next week, we also have a breakfast meeting on Egyptian family law reform at the HUF Bibliothek, the Humanistic Faculty Library. And on Thursday, we will be here again to discuss our friend Viktor Orban and the Hungarian elections. So thank you so much for coming.